vacation horror stories. This is Mr. H. You're listening to Masked Horror. The Harmless Stranger. My New Year's resolution was clear. Embrace independence, explore the world, and face my fears head on. I thought London was the perfect place to start my journey. It was my first time traveling alone, and I figured, why not start with a country that speaks English? London seemed familiar enough, a mix of comfort and excitement, a place where I could test the waters of solo international travel. Besides, being from New York, people said it was kinda like New York. For the first few days, it was everything I dreamed of. I toured the Tower of London, wandered through the British Museum, and even posted my cheesy selfies at Big Ben. I shared everything on Instagram, tagging my location and captioning every post with excitement about my adventure. On my third night, I decided to try a pub a few blocks from my hotel. It was cozy, filled with laughter and the smell of fish and chips. I sat at the bar, nursing a pint, when a man sat down next to me. He introduced himself as Mark, early 30s, clean-shaven, with that casual British charm I'd heard about but never experienced firsthand. We talked for a while. He asked about my trip, where I was from, and what I'd seen so far. His interest felt flattering. When I told him I wanted to find places off the beaten path, he lit up and said, "I know a spot in Notting Hill, best cafe in London, and the tourists never go there." I hesitated for a moment. Meeting a stranger abroad, it sounded like one of those cautionary tales you'd hear on a true crime podcast. But Mark seemed harmless. He was friendly, polite, and didn't come across as pushy. "If you're free tomorrow," he said, "I could show you the way. It's not far from my office." I agreed. After all, how dangerous could it be? The next morning, Mark met me outside my hotel. He looked just as friendly as he had the night before, holding a coffee and joking about the unpredictable London weather. We were going to a cafe, but I thought it was cute that he bought me a coffee as well. I didn't drink it as I had my guard up still, but I tried to loosen up. Another one of my New Year's resolutions, to go with the flow. We started walking towards Notting Hill. We were talking, but as we were talking, looking back, I noticed the streets grew quieter, the bustling crowds thinning until it was just the two of us. I joked about how far the cafe seemed, trying to mask my growing unease. Mark laughed it off, saying, "The best places are always a bit hidden." As we walked, he talked about his life. He mentioned how he lived alone in his family's old house, which he described as peacefully isolated. But the way he said it gave me pause. I noticed his questions became more personal. Did I always travel alone? Did anyone know where I was? What was my hotel room like? I mean, we were strangers, but we weren't technically strangers, as we spoke a lot yesterday. When we finally reached the cafe, it wasn't what I had expected. The place was almost empty, with dim lighting and an odd atmosphere. I ordered tea, but my appetite had vanished. As we sat, Mark leaned in, asking me more about my travel plans. When I tried to steer the conversation elsewhere, he smiled, a little too knowingly, and said, "It's good to have someone looking out for you. You never know what can happen when you're alone." At that moment, something about him felt off. I tried to ignore it, but it stayed on my mind. That night, back at my hotel, I couldn't shake the feeling that I'd made a mistake. As I lay in bed scrolling through my phone, I got a text from an unknown number. "I hope you made it back safely. Mark told me about your trip." My stomach dropped. I never gave Mark my number. I jumped up and double-checked that my door was locked. A few minutes later, the hotel phone rang. It was the front desk, asking if I'd requested a replacement room key. My heart pounded as I told them I hadn't. They assured me everything was fine, but I insisted on changing rooms. I moved 2 floors up, but that night I couldn't sleep. Every sound made me jump. Footsteps in the hall, even the faint creak of the floorboards. Around midnight, I heard a light tapping on my door. At first, I thought it was my imagination, but then it came again. Tap, tap, tap. I crept to the door, looking through the peephole. The hallway was empty. The next morning, I decided to leave London early. I accomplished my goal of traveling, and I saw everything I wanted to see, and it wouldn't cost me a lot of money to change my ticket. I packed, glancing over my shoulder every few seconds. That's when I noticed something chilling. My toothbrush was wet, though I hadn't used it that morning. My suitcase, which was zipped shut the night before, was partially open. Nothing was missing, but it felt like someone had been in the room, touching my things. When I told the front desk, they assured me that no one had accessed my room, but their reassurances did little to calm me. I booked a cab to Heathrow Airport, desperate to get home. As the cab pulled away from the hotel, I finally felt a sense of relief, until I saw him. Mark was standing across the street, half hidden in the shadow of a building. He was watching me. I froze, my breath catching in my throat. He raised his hand and waved a slow, deliberate motion. "Everything all right, miss?" the cab driver asked. I whipped around to tell him to stop, but when I looked back, Mark was gone. By the time I boarded the plane, I felt physically ill. Was I overreacting, or had I narrowly escaped something far worse? When I got home, I couldn't shake the feeling of being watched. A week later, I noticed a new follower on Instagram. The profile had no picture, no posts. It had liked every photo from my trip. It had to be Mark, and I immediately blocked him. London is great, but I don't think I'll be back anytime soon. The night I'll never forget. My buddy Alex and I had been talking about taking a trip for months, and we finally made it happen. Colombia. We had a break from college, and we were going to make the most of it. The nightlife, the energy, the beautiful people. We were excited to experience it all. We booked a nice Airbnb near the center of Medellin, close to the bars and clubs, and spent the first couple of nights just soaking it all in. On our third night, we hit a bar that was packed with locals and a few tourists. It wasn't long before we started talking to two women who were sitting near the dance floor. They were stunning, warm smiles, perfect English, and just enough flirtation to make us feel like kings of the night. Before long, we were buying rounds of drinks and laughing like we'd all been friends for years. By the time the bar closed, Alex suggested we bring them back to our Airbnb. It wasn't far, and honestly, I wasn't about to say no. We walked back together, the streets alive with the late-night buzz of the city. Once inside, we split off. He took his girl to his room, and I went to mine. I don't need to tell you what happened next. Let's just say the night started off exactly how I imagined it would. After some time, the women both got up, almost in sync, saying they had to leave. They seemed friendly enough, no weird vibes, so I didn't think much of it. Alex and I didn't even talk about it. We were both too tired. I locked my door, climbed into bed, and passed out. About an hour later, I woke up to a loud, violent bang on my door. It wasn't a knock. It was more like someone trying to break it down. My heart jumped into my throat as I sat up, disoriented. Then I heard muffled shouting in Spanish, and my stomach sank. I got up, my hands shaking, and approached the door. I didn't open it, but I called out, "Who is it?" A man's voice replied, cold and forceful, "Pay up." My mind raced. Pay up? For what? The women? I realized then what was happening. My chest tightened as I imagined what might be waiting for me on the other side of the door. I yelled back, "I don't understand," but the banging got louder. My phone was across the room, and I didn't dare make a run for it. I was frozen in place. Then I heard another voice outside, a second man, speaking faster, angrier. I don't know if they were armed, but I wasn't about to find out. I grabbed my wallet, opened the door just a crack, and shoved everything I had in cash through the gap. "Take it, just take it," I said, my voice trembling. The man grabbed the money and glared at me through the crack. He didn't say a word, just pocketed the cash and walked away. When he walked away, I saw a gun in his waistband. I slammed the door shut and locked it. My heart pounded so hard, I thought I might pass out. I hadn't even checked my stuff yet. When I went back to my room, my stomach sank. My iPad, my spare cash, they were all gone. But miraculously, my passport was still there. Honestly, I don't know what to think, but I'm just glad it wasn't worse. What if I hadn't paid up? What if they had broken the door down? Later, I found out this kind of thing does happen. Tourists meet locals who seem harmless, only to find themselves robbed, or worse. I'd like to think this won't happen again on our next trip. Next time, we're staying in a hotel and taking precautions. Sometimes you just gotta face your fears. The hidden door. We thought a trip to Vermont would be the perfect getaway, a chance to unplug, unwind, and reconnect as a family. It had been a tough year for all of us. Between work stress, my wife juggling a new job, and our 2 kids constantly glued to their screens, we needed this break. A secluded cabin in the mountains seemed like the answer. I'd spent hours scrolling through the listings before finding the one. It was a rustic house nestled in the woods, with a cozy fireplace, big windows overlooking the mountains, and a promise of total isolation. The pictures made it look like something out of a postcard, quaint, peaceful, and inviting. The reviews were glowing too, with guests raving about how serene and private it was. When we arrived, it was even better than the pictures. The air smelled like pine, the snow blanketed everything in pristine white, and the cabin itself had that warm, woodsy charm that immediately put us at ease. The kids ran around exploring, my wife unpacked, and I stood by the window, taking it all in. No traffic, no noise, no distractions, just us and nature. The first night was everything I'd hoped it would be. We made hot cocoa, watched some TV, and a movie by the fire, and laughed more than we had in months. The kids even put their phones down for once. As the snow began to fall outside, I couldn't stop thinking, this is exactly what we needed. But by the second night, the dream started to crack. It began with a sound, a faint rhythmic thudding. At first, I brushed it off as the house settling or old places making noise, but as the hours passed, the sound grew louder. It wasn't random anymore. It was deliberate, like something or someone was moving behind the walls. After the kids went to bed, I told my wife I'd check it out. Armed with a flashlight, I began inspecting the house. The sound seemed to be coming from the living room. I scanned the space, and something caught my eye. The large bookshelf by the fireplace didn't sit flush against the wall. My heart started pounding. I don't know why, but I felt a creeping sensation of unease. I grabbed the edge of the bookshelf and gave it a tug. It groaned as it slid aside, revealing a hidden door. I froze. Part of me wanted to close the bookshelf and pretend I hadn't seen it, but curiosity, or maybe something deeper, pushed me forward. I turned the handle and opened the door. The air inside was damp and stale, carrying a metallic tang. I stepped into a narrow passage that smelled like mildew. At the end of the hall was a small room. My flashlight beam landed on its contents, and I felt the hairs on the back of my neck rise. There was a single bed in the room, old and rusted, with a thin, stained mattress. The sheets were crumpled as though someone had just gotten up. Next to the bed was a small wooden table with an oil lamp and a stack of books covered in dust. The walls were bare, but the floor was littered with scraps of paper, some scribbled with words, I couldn't make out. I wanted to turn and run, but I forced myself to step inside. The papers on the floor weren't just random scribbles, they were diary entries. They described watching a family, listening to their laughter, waiting for the right moment to. That was all that was left on the entry. I couldn't tell or make out what was going to come after the words, the right moment too. We didn't wait until morning. We got the kids up and we threw everything in our bags and left and drove home. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see something following us. When we got home, I contacted the rental company. They sounded confused when I described the hidden room. After some back and forth, the employee sympathized with me and admitted the property's original owner had disappeared years ago. The house had been sold at auction, and no one knew what really happened to him. I tried to push it out of my mind, to chalk it up to some sick prank by the previous owner, but then, a week later, I finally had time to unpack and found a solitary piece of paper in my bag. It was a crumpled piece of paper that said, "Thanks for visiting. I hope you enjoyed your stay."